worked very well with our people and have great respect for you. And I really appreciate what you're doing. The president has done an incredible job with MS-13. He realizes what a threat they are, and they have been very, very tough. And we all appreciate that. And thank you very much for the agreement. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, we're very happy to be here. It's an honor to be with the President of the United States. And we're hoping that this meeting will only strengthen our relationship even more. And I think it will, because President Trump is very nice and cool, and I'm nice and cool too. So we both use Twitter a lot, so we'll get along.
This is Nayib Bukele. The 43rd president of El Salvador. El Salvador is a country located in Central America, bordered by Honduras and Guatemala, and it has had quite a turbulent history. In a country marred by political corruption, organized gang violence and murder, and the legacy of a civil war, Nayib Bukele has risen to be a powerful populist and political force. He's been in power since 2019, and he has been making quite a name for himself within the country and throughout the entire world. From taking a selfie at the UN General Assembly, making deals with Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, leaking WhatsApp messages with American ambassadors, storming the legislature with soldiers, to his monumental decision to implement Bitcoin as legal tender in the country. The world has been galvanized to this sunglasses wearing, non-tie wearing, and sometimes authoritarian millennial president. And it shows, considering he has over 3.2 million followers on Twitter, which is around half of El Salvador's population of 6.5 million. He has an average approval rating of 85% in the country, which is the highest of any world leader. While many have seen and commented on his surface level performance and wild social media antics, not many have discussed Nayib's origins, El Salvador's political history before Nayib's arrival, and what Nayib's popularity and political hegemony mean for the future of El Salvador. I wish to discuss these developments, being someone who has roots in El Salvador, as well as being interested in Salvadoran history and politics. This is obviously different from what I used to make, but if you enjoyed this analysis, I encourage you to drop a like, subscribe, and comment if you think I should continue making this type of content in the future. Without further ado, let us discuss the phenomenon of Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele. It's the late 80s to early 90s in El Salvador, where the civil war has been raging since 1979. On one side is the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, a coalition of far-left and communist militant groups backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union. On the other side was the Salvadoran military government, made up of the Salvadoran National Army and various paramilitary death squads, who were backed by the United States. Roberto D'Aubuisson, a prominent death squad leader, founded the right-wing Nationalist Republican Alliance, or ARENA, in 1981, with many of the country's presidents during the war being elected under the ARENA banner. The war was brutal, and every Salvadoran experienced loss and hardship during this time. In the late 80s, however, as El Salvador saw the end of the Cold War and the fall of communism in the Eastern Bloc, both sides wanted to end the war, which had slogged into a stalemate. The government and ARENA witnessed the Bush administration in the USA limit their funding, with the FMLN feeling the same after the weakening of communist states like Cuba and the Soviet Union. After 2 years of negotiations, the UN-sponsored Chapultepec Peace Accords was signed in Mexico City in 1992 between representatives of the Salvadoran government and FMLN, ending 12 years of civil war. Among other stipulations, the treaty mandated that the FMLN will be demobilized and will become a legal political party. It was seen as an effort of reconciliation and reintegration of those former left-wing militants back into Salvadoran political society. As El Salvador started on its road to recovery in the 90s and 2000s, national politics would be dominated by the right-wing ARENA and left-wing FMLN, effectively making El Salvador a two-party state.
El proceso que iniciamos hace 4 años con el establecimiento de la paz, como era previsible, ha tenido que pasar por momentos difíciles, generando a veces insatisfacciones y hasta reacciones violentas en algunos sectores. Sin embargo, el proceso no se ha detenido. Sigue y seguirá adelante, porque esa es la voluntad soberana del pueblo salvadoreño.
The 18th Street Gang has found another member. His name is Little Mousy. He's only 9 years old, but today he's getting his first tattoo. Welcome to the new El Salvador. The civil war is long over, but the gang war has just begun.
Although the war was over, violence and criminal activity were still quite prevalent in Salvadoran society. Economic growth remained stagnant, and there was a growing number of people leaving El Salvador for the United States and other Western nations, leading to a massive brain drain and migrant crisis. Today, there are over 2 million Salvadorans living in the United States alone, which is a third of El Salvador's current population. Corruption was endemic in Salvadoran society, with the establishment in Arena and the FMLN equally perpetuating the cycle of corruption. To give some perspective on how pervasive this corruption was, out of the last 4 presidents of El Salvador, 2 were indicted on charges of corruption, and the other 2 are currently hiding in exile and given asylum in Nicaragua to escape prosecution. For example, former Arena President Perez was caught pocketing $15 million donated by Taiwan, which was intended for the victims of the 2001 earthquakes. The most recent ex-president, FMLN leader Salvador Sanchez Seren, is currently wanted on charges of corruption and money laundering, but is currently hiding in Nicaragua as of this recording. This corruption was rampant, from national leaders like presidents to local leaders like police and mayors. And that's not to mention the brutality and growing power of gang violence in the country. As the United States started deporting illegal migrants from El Salvador in the early 2000s, many of them members of various gangs, including the infamous Mara Salvatrucha gang, or MS-13, would be incredibly powerful and influential, creating a long wave of chaos and homicide in the country. These gangs looked to backwater communities for control. They would hold territory and hold communities practically up for ransom. They would also engage in drug and sex trafficking. Being murdered from gang violence became a tragic yet common occurrence in communities and families all throughout the country. El Salvador effectively became the murder capital of the world, hitting a peak of 104 murders per 100,000 residents. And yet, there were no solutions. Police were being bribed or threatened by the gangs, and even vigilante groups like La Sombra Negra were widely ineffective at stemming the wave of violence. Even when police threw gangs in prison, which was a rarity, they would allow them to use technology like cell phones or computers. These gangs would use these to give murder orders to their fellow members. Because of this increased violence and corruption, El Salvador became an international pariah, incapable of keeping itself together from violence and instability. It was harsh what he said, but Trump truly was right that El Salvador was a shithole. It was fundamentally broken and something that no other country should replicate. However, things were changing, even if some did not realize it yet. From the corrupt governments and extreme amount of violence, a feeling of disillusionment started to fester within the Salvadoran population, and they wished for a strong leader who would finally tackle these issues and bring societal stability and economic growth to the country. It was fertile ground for a populist and anti-establishment takeover, one that Nayib Bukele would take advantage of.
Soy Nayib Bukele, candidato a la alcaldía de Nuevo Cuscatlán. Mis padres me enseñaron que con esfuerzo y dedicación se logran las metas. Así he trabajado siempre en mis empresas. Sin embargo, creo que es tiempo de trascender y trabajar en la construcción de nuestro país y sobre todo de mi municipio Nuevo Cuscatlán. Sueño con un municipio modelo de desarrollo, donde vivamos mejor, en un ambiente moderno y seguro. Cuento contigo.
Nayib Armando Bukele Ortez was born in San Salvador, El Salvador, on July 24, 1981, to Olga Ortez de Bukele and Armando Bukele Catan, both Palestinian Salvadoran Christians. His father, Armando, would study and graduate with a PhD in industrial chemistry and hold several degrees in journalism and various sciences. Armando would use these degrees to good use, becoming a very successful businessman, and founded various companies dedicated to textiles, commerce, pharmaceuticals, advertising, and media. Armando sympathized with the left-wing ideology of the FMLN and spoke in favor of a free Palestinian state. Nayib would go on to study law at the Central American University, but dropped out in his freshman year, and started a Yamaha motorcycle shop, as well as working for his father's public relations firm, which was running campaigns for the FMLN. Nayib would meet a professional ballerina and prenatal psychologist named Gabriela Rodriguez, eventually getting into a relationship with her. At an early age, Nayib had a strong interest in politics and started promotional work for the FMLN. His marketing strategies impressed party leaders, allowing him to move up the ranks. In 2012, he would launch his political career when he ran for mayor mayor of the city of Nuevo Cuscatlán, a town outside the capital of San Salvador.
Nuevo Cuscatlán es ahorita y lo ha sido siempre un pueblito pequeño, relativamente abandonado, olvidado. Básicamente incluso casi nadie lo conocía en El Salvador. No tiene infraestructura básica, agua potable, alcantarillado, no tiene las cosas básicas que la mayoría de salvadoreños están acostumbrados.
He would run with the FMLN, defeating his Arena opponent. Right off the bat, it was clear that Nayib was different from any other political official. Nayib had a priority of combating gang violence, and it was incredibly effective. Before Nayib took office, the town had 12 homicides a year, but throughout his entire tenure of 3 years, there was only 1 homicide.
De un plan de 3 ejes que es dentro de la seguridad. El primero es el de combate, el segundo eje es el de la prevención, el tercero es el de reinserción. Con esos 3 ejes, poder evitar la delincuencia, y hasta ahora hemos reducido homicidios a 0, que es el delito más grave y el que más afecta a las familias.
Bukele also had an agenda of providing welfare, providing all adults over the age of 55 a monthly basket to cover their nutritional needs. He would also donate his salary for scholarships for local students in order to give students opportunities instead of letting them become desperate, joining gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18. During his tenure, Nayib would marry his decade-long sweetheart Gabriela, who encouraged him to keep going in his governing agenda. All of these achievements made Mayor Bukele wildly popular in Nuevo Cuscatlán and a breath of fresh air from all these other politicians. FMLN leadership, however, although disliking Bukele's governing style, could not deny his popularity. However, it was clear that Nayib was a very ambitious character, and he wasn't going to settle with just holding local office. His next stop was San Salvador.
El partido FMLN reveló hoy los nombres de los principales candidatos a las alcaldías de los 262 municipios del país para las elecciones de 2015. El actual alcalde de Nuevo Cuscatlán, Nayib Bukele, competirá por la alcaldía de San Salvador.
Para el municipio de San Salvador, al compañero joven, alcalde de Nuevo Cuscatlán, por cierto, todo el mundo lo sabe, Nayib Bukele.
El anuncio oficial fue hecho por el secretario general del partido FMLN, Medardo González, quien confirmó que fue evaluado entre otras figuras que se desempeñan como funcionarios de gobierno.
Following the end of his tenure as mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán in 2015, Nayib Bukele was riding high in terms of popularity from the San Salvador region. He would act accordingly and announced his candidacy for mayor of San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. Although the FMLN party leadership still viewed Nayib's political governing style and prospects negatively, they gave their support and nominated him the FMLN candidate for mayor. When election day came in the city, Nayib would come to be victorious, defeating his Arena opponent, becoming San Salvador's next mayor. He was able to shape the future of the capital city and catch the eye of the entire country in the process.
Quiero decirles que esta administración no ha venido con revanchismos, ni con vendetas, ni a preguntarle cuál es su partido político favorito. Todos tenemos diferencias, pero al final hay cosas que nos unen que son más fuertes que las que nos separan. Trabajemos unidos para sacar adelante esta ciudad, que ha sido el sueño de muchos y que esta vez debemos de lograrlo.
Bukele, as mayor, was focused on combating the power of the gangs. Although he did this through conventional means, such as providing infrastructure and arms to police forces, he put an emphasis on youth outreach and opportunities because he reasoned that the gangs took advantage of these young people's desperation.
People that are committing the crimes are 18-year-old, 16-year-old, 17-year-old. So if we had investors in the communities, all of this will be positive agents of change.
Just like when he was mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, Bukele introduced various social programs for both the youth and elderly, and once again, made him incredibly popular with San Salvador residents. Secondly, Bukele was also focused on creating various infrastructure projects such as expanding roads, renovation of buildings, and the expansion of telecommunications. Primarily, he had a priority of cleaning up the city, especially the historic city center. Before Nayib came in, the center of San Salvador was dirty, violent, and anything but idyllic. It was common to see gang activity, prostitution, and other illegal activities being conducted in the city center, even outside the National Palace and Cathedral. Under Bukele's leadership, many parts of the city were cleaned up, and armed police were stationed throughout the areas to combat illegal activities. Buildings were repainted, facades were restored, and some roads were blocked off for car traffic, used only for pedestrians. Restaurants and bars started opening up in the area, helping to transform the city from a dangerous backwater into a beautiful public square that appealed to locals and tourists alike. Bukele would also look for international cooperation and development in the city, meeting with the mayors of Panama City and Washington, D.C., as well as meeting with Taiwanese President Tsang Ing-wen for strengthening ties between San Salvador and Taipei, and even getting the keys to the city of Gaithersburg, Maryland, USA, with September 11th in the city being classified as Mayor Nayib Bukele's Day. Overall, it was clear that Bukele was getting more ambitious as time went on, and his city experienced a higher amount of development, security, and cleanliness. Although the crime was still present in everyday San Salvador residents' lives, Bukele was able to manage the situation better than his predecessors. However, Bukele became more outspoken about the corruption and dysfunctions within the FMLN party leadership and where it was headed. The FMLN, who were already negative towards Bukele, sought to marginalize and politically isolate him. This conflict would possibly make or break Nayib Bukele's political future.
El edil sigue sin hablar públicamente de su pleito con el FMLN, pero a través de sus redes sociales ha acusado a la dirigencia del partido de estar negociando la alcaldía de San Salvador con Arena.
Que me parece absurda la postura del alcalde, ¿no? Me parece absurda porque el tipo de frase y el tipo de acusación son del tipo y de la calidad de Arena, de la derecha. Yo digo, bueno, y entonces ¿para qué necesito a la derecha si ahí está el alcalde acusándome de la manera como lo hace?
Pero aún con este malestar que ha provocado Bukele, dice que su futuro dentro del partido no depende de la dirigencia, sino del Tribunal de Ética.
In September 2017, the Ethics Court of the FMLN announced that they would be investigating Nayib Bukele for supposed abuses within the party. Nayib boycotted the meeting, arguing that they were biased against him. During their deliberations, the court accused Bukele of, quote-unquote, defamation and creating intra-party division by creating acts and speaking things against the political party. This included a wide array of criticism for party bureaucrats and even the party elder and current Salvadoran president at the time, Salvador Sánchez Serén. Secondly, they believe that Nayib was working for his own political gain and power, calling him a quote-unquote messianic leader without a revolutionary heart. Finally, they allege that Bukele broke the party's charter on women's human rights by allegedly verbally and physically attacking Xochitl Marchelli, a female party member. During a meeting of the San Salvador Municipal Council regarding the remodeling of squares in the historic center, Marchelli and another member of the party voted against some of the plans, causing a defeat for Bukele's agenda. Mayor Bukele, upset by the decision, allegedly ended the meeting and stormed out of the office. He came back, standing in front of his chair with an apple in his hand. He threw the apple at Marchelli, yelling, "Here, take the apple home, witch!" Bukele denies these accusations, but still, it feels oddly specific of an accusation, doesn't it? After more than 18 hours of deliberation in October, the court determined that Mayor Bukele was guilty of these abuses, and he was expelled from the ranks of the Fromundo Martí National Liberation Front. Bukele, the popular mayor of San Salvador, was now a politically independent without backing from any party. The expelling of Bukele, who was incredibly popular with FMLN voters, created a backlash, which led to the FMLN losing power over 20 municipalities and 8 Senate seats in the upcoming 2018 elections. Nayib used this controversy to his advantage since he positioned himself as a political outsider, fighting against and rejecting the corruption and swamp-like nature of Arena and especially the FMLN. While Nayib was putting the security and opportunities of his people first, the leadership of the FMLN was more worried about playing ideological games and embezzling money from the population. Nayib was outside of the rigidity of how the parties conducted themselves. He was a different kind of leader, with new ideas. And thus, Nayib Bukele, in the same month that he was expelled from the FMLN, founded his new party, Nuevas Ideas, New Ideas. And with the founding of this new party, he had greater ambitions than just the mayor of the capital. He wanted to be president.
Ayer, el pueblo demostró que las cúpulas partidarias no tienen ningún poder, que es el pueblo quien decide. Y aunque las cúpulas de los partidos tradicionales no lo entiendan y no lo vean, nosotros estamos obligados a entenderlo. Ellos que sigan viendo su árbol. Nosotros estamos obligados a ver el bosque. Ellos que sigan contando diputados y alcaldías, cuántos sacó uno, cuántos no sacó el otro. Nosotros tenemos que entender que el pueblo, así como rechazó a los partidos tradicionales, en cualquier momento también podría rechazarnos a nosotros. Es por eso que este es un momento para que abramos las puertas de nuestro movimiento de par en par e invitemos a todos nuestros hermanos salvadoreños a unírsenos. Este es el momento para que juntos construyamos las nuevas ideas, que deberá ser un movimiento de representación legítima del pueblo salvadoreño siempre.
When Nayib Bukele announced the formation of Nuevas Ideas, the political establishment in both Arena and the FMLN fought tooth and nail in order to block the legal formation of the party, and thus blocking Bukele from running in the 2019 presidential election. Bukele was widely popular across El Salvador, and polls highlighted that he was favored to win had he ran, so he had that down. His next challenge was registering for his party through the courts. Under Salvadoran law, a political party can only be formalized by getting 50,000 signatures of support within 90 days. This was not a challenge, since Bukele was able to reach 200,000 signatures in only 3 days. However, the Salvadoran Supreme Electoral Tribunal, or TSE, did not approve of the party in time for the 2019 elections, so Bukele had to run with another party in order to compete in the election. And he founded it in a small left-wing party called Cambio Democrático, or Democratic Change. However, the TSC was playing dirty, and they had plans to block CD from running in the elections on the day of the deadline of registration, July 25th, 2018. They were planning on announcing it the day after the deadline passed, so Bukele would be forced to sit out 2019. However, Bukele got word of the private meeting of the tribunal hours before the midnight deadline, so he quietly withdrew his support from CD and approached the right-wing Grand Alliance for National Unity, or GANA party. With less than an hour before the deadline, Nayib Bukele made a deal with GANA party leaders, and they agreed that he would run for president under the GANA ticket. And once the deadline passed, the tribunal announced that CD would be blocked from running. However, Nayib Bukele literally teleported right behind them, announcing that he had severed ties with CD and that he was a candidate under the banner of GANA, and it was official. Nayib Bukele was now registered to be the GANA candidate for president of the Republic of El Salvador. There was no turning back, and the political establishment was going to pay the price.
Este día es histórico para nuestro país. Este día, El Salvador destruyó el bipartidismo. Este día pasamos por fin, después de 27 años de firmados los acuerdos de paz, este día, 3 de febrero de 2019, pasamos por fin la página de la posguerra. Este día es histórico. Hemos ganado masivamente, con más votos que Arena y el Frente unidos.
The Salvadoran people, already sick of the corruption of the political system, were exposed to the naked and overt attempts to marginalize Nayib Bukele from the political process, and that was considered the last straw. And thus, a silent majority rallied behind Bukele and his message of anti-corruption, populism, and the elimination of the gangs. Bukele, by this point, was completing his tenure as mayor of the capital, and he had certainly left his mark on the city. Opinion polls from late 2018 to early 2019 widely supported Bukele. Supporters disparaged the FMLN as a facade of a party that pretended to care about the welfare of the people, and disparaged Arena as a party that worked exclusively for business interests. Bukele heavily used social media, tweeting events and going live on Instagram and Facebook frequently. While most of these politicians governed in a way that was distant from the average person's day-to-day life, Nayib Bukele made it a mission to use social media to connect to the average citizen. The average citizen could now communicate directly with him, and he had the ability to respond. This ultimately resulted in Bukele being more accessible to the average citizen, increasing his popularity even further. Bukele took selfies, wore leather jackets, and had a slick-back hairstyle, making him more relatable to the average person. Bukele nominated Felix Ulloa to be his running mate, an elder lawyer and politician. Bukele and his now pregnant wife Gabriela expected a win, but they did not think that it would be such a blowout win. On the day of the vote, February 3rd, 2019, Nayib Bukele triumphed over his opponents Gallega and Martinez of the Arena and FMLN respectively. It was the first time since the Civil War ended in 1992 that a party outside of the major two parties held power. He won 53% of the vote, carrying all 14 states and having a popular vote count of 1.4 million. There was now no need for a runoff election. Bukele was now president of El Salvador.
Descansen. Descanso.
En estos momentos presenciaremos el ingreso del señor presidente electo de la República y señora de Bukele.
Escuela Militar, atención.
Nayib Bukele took office as president on June 1st, 2019 in San Salvador. While most presidents were inaugurated in the Legislative Palace, Bukele made a strategic move to take office in front of the Presidential Palace, in the very square he renovated as mayor of the city. Following Bukele's formal taking of office, he had the people raise their right hand and take a pledge along with him.
Juramos trabajar todos para sacar nuestro país adelante. Juramos defender lo conquistado el 3 de febrero. Juramos que cambiaremos nuestro país contra todo obstáculo, contra todo enemigo, contra toda barrera, contra todo muro. Nadie se interpondrá entre Dios y su pueblo para poder cambiar El Salvador. Muchas gracias. Que Dios bendiga El Salvador. Que Dios bendiga el nuevo gobierno y que Dios bendiga a uno y cada uno de los salvadoreños.
President Bukele had only 5 years to his disposal, so he worked quick to make it count. I'd personally like to briefly list some of his achievements and proposals. Hopefully I get to discuss more of these in future videos with much more detail, but now let's go through an overview of President Bukele's achievements and agenda.
Why do you think so many people have moved from this country to the U.S.?
Well, it's obvious. I mean, our country has failed to provide two basic things, which are the two main drivers of immigration, which is the lack of economic opportunity and the lack of security. And so those are the main drivers of immigration. Our country has failed to provide security and economic opportunity, so people leave.
President Nayib Bukele very much views mass immigration from El Salvador to the United States as a negative thing. He recognizes that dangerous actors make money from smuggling people to the USA, and he even takes responsibility for actors that end up harmed or killed along the journey. While other politicians, especially in the FMLN, will deflect the responsibility by blaming quote-unquote American imperialism. For example, in early 2019, a story broke that a Salvadoran man named Oscar Ramirez, along with his daughter Valiera, drowned in the Rio Grande River trying to reach the USA. Bukele personally took responsibility for the deaths, saying that economic and security issues in the country caused them to take the risk of fleeing.
What country did they flee? They fled. Did they fled the United States? They fled, I mean, they fled El Salvador. They fled our country. It is our fault.
During the time of Donald Trump's administration, Bukele and Trump made various agreements limiting the number of migrants from El Salvador to the United States. Bukele also argues that letting the most determined workers leave for the USA is bad because El Salvador would rather enjoy their full economic productivity in the country rather than a small portion of their earnings and remittances.
If you send your hardworking people and your talented people and people that want to work and want to risk it just to go and work, you want to keep them here because those will be the drivers of your economy. You don't want them there so they could send a remittance, which would be a small portion of what they will earn and what they produce. You want them to produce here.
And speaking of economics, in El Salvador, a quarter of the population lives in poverty, and Bukele wishes to alleviate that by creating jobs in various sectors such as infrastructure, agriculture, technology, sports, and teaching. For example, El Salvador is currently working with the Chinese government on providing funding to expand the port of Acajulta, providing manufacturing, trade, tourism, and fishing. He's been making agreements with nations like China, the United States, Japan, and Russia. And that's not to mention El Salvador's monumental decision to implement Bitcoin as legal tender in the country, which happened in June 2021.
I will send to Congress a bill that will make Bitcoin a legal tender in El Salvador. In the short term, this will generate jobs and help provide financial inclusion to thousands outside the formal economy.
There is a lot to be said about this decision, which could be its own separate video, but to keep it short, Bukele believes that Bitcoin will be beneficial in getting foreign investment, tourism, and especially remittances. According to the World Bank, in 2020, remittances made up 24% of El Salvador's economy, which comes from Salvadorans abroad, mainly in the United States, providing money to their families back home. Bitcoin, with its low fees and instant access, could be a way of providing more income to Salvadorans compared to other money transfer methods like Western Union, driving economic growth. However, this could be a separate video in and of itself, so do let me know if you would like to see me make a video on the pros and cons of Bitcoin adoption in the country.
Your other huge problem is the gangs. How are you going to root out the gangs?
First, we send the army to the streets. That's probably not very popular internationally, but it was needed in our country. We made a map of, we call it a heat map, where you have most of the violent crimes that are committed in the most populous areas. So we concentrated the police force and the armed forces in those areas where you have the most crimes.
Fighting against criminal activity is one of President Bukele's major tasks because he ran on a platform of defeating MS-13 and Barrio 18 and taking back control over territory. Shortly after he took office, President Bukele announced his territorial control plan, where he would equip the National Army and Civil Police Force to combat the hegemony of the gangs in various cities. This has been largely effective, and El Salvador's homicide rate has fallen from 52 homicides per 100,000 in 2018 to 36 per 100,000 in 2019. In 2020, that number became 19.7 per 100,000 residents. El Salvador is still a very dangerous country with gangs controlling many neighborhoods to this day, but it is an effective start to combating their power. Secondly, Bukele enacted prison reform. No longer would the gangs be allowed to operate technology in their cells. Under Bukele's orders, technology would be removed, jail cells were boarded up to discourage communication with the outside world, and even mixed jail cells with rival gang members. When speaking about the prisons, Bukele said, "From now on, all the gang cells in our country will remain sealed. They will no longer be able to see outside the cell. This will prevent them from using signs to communicate with the hallway. They will be inside, in the dark, with their friends from other gangs." Finally, in September of 2019, Bukele founded the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, which combated various crimes including drug trafficking, corruption, and white-collar crimes. All of these have been incredibly effective. Police finally have arms to fight against the gangs have been crippled in organizing while in prison, and the commission has been strong in combating corruption in Salvadoran society. It's looking up for a country that literally 6 years ago was considered the murder capital of the world. Just recently, Salvadoran police just conducted the largest drug seizure as part of the territorial control plan. 4,100 grams of cocaine worth $103.9 million, or 2,050 Bitcoin.
Así creo que nosotros, viéndonos en el espejo de otros países como Italia, como China, como Corea del Sur, hemos decidido declarar cuarentena para todo el territorio nacional.
On March 11, 2020, following the classification of COVID-19 as a pandemic, President Bukele imposed a lockdown, shut down the borders, and all travel to El Salvador before there was even a single case. There was even a diplomatic dispute that took place between El Salvador and Mexico, with Bukele accusing the Mexican government of being irresponsible by allowing a flight filled with a dozen people with COVID-19 to fly into El Salvador. Secondly, Bukele established Hospital El Salvador, the largest hospital in Latin America. To help those under lockdown, Bukele sent families care packages every week, such as medicine and foodstuff. Finally, El Salvador has been working hard to distribute vaccines with help from the Chinese government. El Salvador has been able to vaccinate most of the population, all without enforcing a mandate or vaccine passport. In fact, Bukele has been critical of countries like Australia for enforcing vaccine mandates or passports. El Salvador's number of COVID cases has been quite low compared to its neighbors of Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and the economy has been making a slow recovery from the lockdowns of 2020. Let's just hope that El Salvador will only recover from the pandemic.
You know, your politics are so rooted in social media. Yeah. How much of your success in governing do you think is about social media? And
a lot of it. I think people don't realize that social media is not like a game. Social media is more as a social network, because right now we're all interconnected.
Finally, social media is something that has defined Bukele's time in office. While he's been having fun on social media, like posting a selfie from his 2019 UN General Assembly speech, a Photoshop of him in a UFO, and posting a video of Hitler and Stalin singing. Yes, seriously. However, Bukele has used social media as a tool of governing. For example, at the beginning of his administration, he launched a purge of corrupt government bureaucrats, and he did it through Twitter. These people were essentially fired through Twitter. It became so prevalent that the phrase "se les ordena" became a meme on Salvadoran social media. Secondly, Bukele has used social media, apps like WhatsApp, as an easy way of reaching his government ministers and aides, even outside the country. For example, when he was outside of the country for several weeks visiting China, Qatar, and Japan, meeting their heads of state, he was still able to govern through Twitter and WhatsApp.
But how come you've been 3 weeks out of your country? Who's governing there? I said, I am. When the interview's finished, I will check my WhatsApp and see what has happened. And any of my ministers would text me anything and say, hey, this is happening. Well, they haven't woke up yet, but when they wake up, they will send me, this is happening right now. Or probably I will listen to something first on Twitter than my ministers. And then I will ask them, what's going on with this?
Salvadorans can read his thoughts and agenda plans from their screens, and not from the formal government statements or media headlines. For example, immediately after Bukele took the speech at the UN, he boldly claimed that,
Créanme, muchas más personas verán esa selfie que las que escucharán este discurso. Hemos oído muchas buenas ideas, muchos discursos interesantes, pero realmente la forma en que venimos hablando aquí no ha cambiado desde hace 74 años. Tal vez dentro de algunos años no tengamos que viajar decenas de miles de personas a Nueva York a reunirnos en este edificio, cuando una serie de conferencias hubieran costado varios centenares de millones de dólares menos, y estoy seguro que prácticamente hubieran tenido el mismo efecto y el mismo impacto.
And he was vindicated about that quote because the year after that speech was conducted, every world leader, including Bukele, presented their speeches from Zoom in their home countries. President Nayib Bukele has had quite an eventful 2.5 years. He's witnessed tremendous success such as international cooperation and his fight against crime, and challenges such as the recent tension with the Biden administration and domestic protests against his Bitcoin law. But what does the future hold for Nayib Bukele? Bukele remains incredibly popular with his people, and his future isn't stopping anytime soon. In September 2021, the Salvadoran Supreme Court ruled that President Bukele is eligible to serve 2 consecutive 5-year terms in office. Previously, in 2014, the court ruled that presidents could run again after waiting 10 years after their first term ends. That means that Bukele is eligible to run for re-election in 2024. And if re-elected at that time, Bukele can run El Salvador until 2029. Bukele also has control over the Legislative Assembly, since Bukele's party, Nuevas Ideas, won a landslide victory earlier in 2021 at the expense of Arena and the FMLN. The FMLN and Arena, meanwhile, have united in their opposition and hatred of Bukele, calling him a dictator, fascist, and autocrat. While the United States has become more hostile to Bukele's authoritarian way of governing, which started after Joe Biden took office, China has become closer, signing various deals with Bukele such as funding for ports and infrastructure as well as vaccine distribution. It will certainly be interesting to see how Bukele will align in the geopolitical struggle between Chinese and American power. A new era has truly begun in El Salvador, since Arena and the FMLN, enemies who fought a civil war against each other for more than a decade, have now united in their opposition to the new political force that is Nayib Bukele and Nuevas Ideas. It certainly will be an enlightening experience for the country of El Salvador. The story of Nayib Bukele is a story of success in the face of adversity. It is also a story of an outsider rebelling against the system. El Salvador was once dominated by 2 parties for 30 years, following a vicious civil war. Those 30 years were a time of economic instability, crime, violence, corruption, mass migration, and loss. Nayib Bukele, like much of the population, grew up and was raised during the time of the civil war in this period of decline. He was frustrated with the system as much as the Salvadoran population was. When he got involved in politics, he tried being a new kind of leader, and was marginalized by the political establishment. They rejected him, blocked him from participating in the political process, and smeared him. Nevertheless, he persisted. He was a college dropout who owned a motorcycle dealership and worked for his father's public relations firm. From there, became mayor of Nueva Cuscatlan, then San Salvador, and then president of the entire country. And now he's become internationally well known, even appearing on Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People of 2021, alongside Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Xi Jinping. El Salvador has truly transitioned into a new era under Nayib Bukele, and hopefully, the Salvadoran people will finally find peace, prosperity, and growth after 3 decades of decline and instability.
Así como una familia que tiene a su hijo enfermo, la familia va a hacer lo imposible por salvar al niño, pero no va a ser fácil.
van a tener desvelos, van a acompañarlo, van a estar pendientes de su salud, dándole medicina, van a tener cambios en su rutina, van a sufrir con él. Pero no importa todo lo que hagan, porque todo es por el mismo objetivo común: sacar adelante a su hijo, sacar adelante la salud de ese niño. Nuestro país es como un niño enfermo. Nos toca ahora a todos cuidarlo. Nos toca ahora a todos tomar un poco de medicina amarga. Nos toca ahora a todos sufrir un poco. Nos toca ahora a todos tener un poco de dolor, asumir nuestra responsabilidad y todos como hermanos sacar adelante a ese niño que es nuestra familia, es nuestro país, es El Salvador.